Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel, or if it's your first time here, welcome. I hope you enjoy your stay. Today's a video that I've been looking forward to for a few months now, since my involvement in SPFBO8 started up as a member of the judging crew for Team Bookborn. Because I've finished the 6 books that I was allocated to read, this video is going to be my kind of summary, my wrap up of those 6 reads, and I'll go through which books I've cut from the competition and which one I'm going to be putting forward as a semi-finalist for Bookborn to read. So let's go take a look at the books. So the 6 books I read for SPFBO8 all loosely at least fall into the category of epic fantasy, which is my favourite subgenre, and that of course is why I put my hand up to read each of these titles. I'm not going to go through full synopses for these books or delve too deeply into my thoughts for them, because each of these titles has had a dedicated review on my channel. There's only room for I think 5 cards per video, so instead of putting cards up for these when I get to them, I will link all of the videos in the description box below if you haven't checked out the individual reviews, especially if there's a title that you're particularly interested in. Please do go and take a look at those. The 6 books that I read though, I'll put up here in the random order that I read them in. I started off with The Blood of Outcasts by D.A. Smith, then I moved on to The Soul's Aspect by Mark Holloway, The Priel's Fools by Michael D'Angelo, then I read Fire of the Forebears by L.A. Buck, A Phantom's Vengeance by Marco Mitzi, and then the last title I had was I Shall Return with Winter by C.F. Welburn. So the kind of directive that I had when I was given these books was to read at least some of all of them. There's no requirement to finish all of these books, although that was my intention because I don't generally DNF a book. And then once I had read all of my allocation, hopefully there would be one that really stands head and shoulders above the rest that I would put forward as a semi-finalist. That semi-finalist would then be read by Bookborn, along with a semi-finalist from my other judges, Leslie from The Nerdy Narrative, Pete from Ponderings of Pete, Michael Nip and Joanna Souza, and from those semi-finalists Bookborn would put forward her favourite as a finalist. That is getting a little bit ahead of ourselves though, so let's just focus on these 6 books that I've got at the moment. So as you might expect, with 6 very different books from 6 very different authors, I had a very different experience with each of these titles. Some of them I really enjoyed, some of them I didn't enjoy so much, and of course then the rest of them fell into that middle ground. What I'm going to do here is go through in kind of a reverse order, looking at the ones that I had less of a good experience with first of all, and finishing, if you like, on a high, where I'll go through the ones that I enjoyed the most and announce at that point which of these books is going to be my semi-finalist, because I am pleased to say that I did find one of these titles that I think is worthy of being a semi-finalist and potential future finalist for the competition. So I will start off with A Phantom's Vengeance by Marco Mitzi, because if you've seen the video review I put up for this title, or you've seen my review on Instagram or Goodreads, you'll know that I didn't actually finish this book. This is the only DNF I had in my selection. As I say, I don't normally DNF a book, so it has to be something that kind of has a real reason for me to do so. I am quite stubborn and will generally push on through a book. This one, I found there were some elements of the writing that just didn't gel with me. I found myself scratching my head a few times with some of the phrasing, trying to figure out what on earth was actually being meant by something that just seemed completely out of place. There were also a few bits I said in my review where I had to kind of track back a few pages to double check something because I thought that it was being contradicted a little bit later on. So it wasn't the best writing experience that I had, but then there was also some specific content as well, which kind of acted as the straw that broke the camel's back and made my decision for me that I wouldn't be finishing. This was the 5th book I read from my allocation, so by that point I already knew that I had a couple of books which were definitely going to be finishing higher up in my estimation. So because I knew that this one wasn't going to be my semi-finalist, I decided to put that one down, and A Phantom's Vengeance by Marco Mitzi was a cut from the competition. From the 5th book I read to the first book I read, we come to The Blood of Outcasts by D.A. Smith. This was, as were a couple of the titles actually that I read here, this was a revenge story, and it was a very bloody and brutal revenge story, and I didn't mind it whatsoever for that. I thought it was generally quite well done. The story overall, the setting, kind of an Asian, Japanese inspired setting with ronin and katanas and various creatures of Japanese folklore and mythology. And overall, I felt that it was quite an interesting story. What I didn't like here, again, was actually the writing, where I think it was a little bit let down by some sentences that didn't really make too much sense to me. It was a writing style overall that I've seen a few times and it just doesn't work for me. There are plenty of people that it will work for or who just won't mind it, and that's absolutely great for them and great for the author, because he definitely has an audience and they'll be waiting eagerly to hear more about this story. For me though, I'm not part of that audience. It just didn't quite work for me because I was having a little bit of a difficult time reading the book fluently. This was another one that, although I finished it, I did decide to cut it from the competition. Next up, I'm going to talk about Priel's Fools by Michael D'Angelo. This was another story that I quite enjoyed, but that didn't quite work for me for a number of different reasons. And again, one of those was the writing, a few of the individual kind of nuances that the author had. Amongst those, one that really stood out to me personally was what I felt was an over repetition of a certain phrase. So in this one, we have a mercenary group who are the key antagonists of the story, and they are called the Ebon Hammer. And the individuals of that group were always referred to as the Ebon Hammer mercenary or the Ebon Hammer soldier or whatever it was. And it just again took it out of me because some of them became a real mouthful. I think there was one I referred to in my video review, which still sticks in my head now, was the woman who fought on behalf of the Ebon Hammer. And it could have just said the swordswoman or the soldier or something along those lines and be done with it in much less of a mouthful. The story overall I thought was quite good, but there was a little bit too much convenience in there. I felt that it could have done with a little bit more depth, a little bit more complexity. So overall, although it was kind of an enjoyable time, I wanted to enjoy my time with it more, and this is another one that I ended up cutting from the competition. So that's half of my allocation gone, and the remaining 3 titles are Soul's Aspect, Fire of the Forebears, and I Shall Return with Winter. I actually enjoyed all of these. I would say that having a good time with 3 out of 6 is pretty good going. What it did mean though is it gave me a potentially difficult decision when it comes to cutting 2 of these books from the competition and moving one of them forward, but that's what I'm here for. So the early front runner for my semi-finalist place was the Soul's Aspect by Mark Holloway, because this was the second book that I read and I had, as I said, a really good time with this one. I felt that it maybe took a little bit of time to get going. It was a bit slow starting. It was a book that had 3 distinct parts, although the third part, the most exciting part, that gives me a lot of hope for the continuation of the series. That part was only a relatively short part, but I don't mind that because in the meantime, in the first part and the second part especially, you got a lot of build up, you've got a lot of character development, you learn a lot about the world and about the magic that they have there, and I really appreciated that. As I say, I am really looking forward to the continuation of this. This is definitely one that I'm going to be reading book 2 of. I've put both book 1 and book 2 on my wish list, so that tells you what a good time I had with this particular story. Fire of the Forebears was then the next up of my final 3, and again this was a really interesting read. It was one of 2 titles actually that I had my eye on before the competition started, so when I found they were in our allocation I immediately put my hand up and said I wanted those 2. First of those was The Blood of Outcasts, and the second was this one, The Fire of the Forebears. And I'm really pleased that this one I had a much better time with and became one of my favourite books of the competition, or at least of the books that I read for the competition. I loved the world building in this one. I thought it was not necessarily unique, but it had kind of a unique way of putting across this world and these particular elements. There were talking animals in it, but they were in the background. They weren't in your face, a real key part of the story. But at the same time, despite being in the background, they were actually quite important. So that really doesn't make sense, but it was done so well in the story. It was all just natural to the characters, even if it wasn't natural to me as a reader. There were centaurs as well, and they're kind of an overlooked creature, I suppose. Everybody knows about centaurs, we see them in so many things, but they are always background characters. They don't really play any real kind of important part. But here we got to see a bit more of them. We got to see centaur family life and society, and I really appreciated that, and there are actually some pretty cool centaur characters that played an important part in this story. Overall, it wasn't really what I was expecting. It was very much a self-contained story. This is book one of a series, but it didn't really feel like it. So if you prefer a standalone to a series, I would still say that you could get away with that from Fire of the Forebears. I would say the same as well for I Shall Return with Winter, which was the last book I read. This one I think might actually be a standalone rather than a book one in a series. But again, like Fire of the Forebears, it was all wrapped up neatly in the one package. This was the third of the stories that I read which focused on a plot of revenge, but actually despite it being the main catalyst for the story and the main kind of theme I suppose in terms of the synopsis, it's not as much of a key part of the story as I would have expected it to be. I do like that because I like what we got instead. We got to look at the people instead of the revenge element. We've got a lot of character development here with the main character, and I said in my review for this one that I really appreciated looking at the people that we have in this story, the Skelgs, who are the aggressors here. I appreciated looking at them through the eyes of an outsider, someone who hates these people but starts to know them and to understand them, and I like the way that the perceptions change as a result of that. So this one, like the previous two, had a few little ups and downs, but nothing that was really what I would call a major issue, and so I had a really good time reading it. That did leave me with a bit of a decision though, but I was looking at this in two different ways. One was my overall enjoyment, but also a really key factor for me is kind of, as much as possible, taking me out of the equation. Do I think any of these books is good enough to be a semi-finalist? Do I think any of these books is good enough to be a potential finalist in the competition? And ultimately, that's where I made my decision. So rather than choosing my favourite, I've chosen as my semi-finalist the book that I think can go furthest in the competition. And that, of course, is based on my decision, so it's not necessarily the correct decision. Everyone has their own reading taste, but there's only one way to find out, and that is to see how far my semi-finalist does now go in the competition. So with my three remaining titles, I really do feel that I had two that were on a very similar level, that were really good titles, but I just couldn't quite see as a finalist, maybe as a semi-finalist, but I couldn't see as a finalist of the competition, and so I cut those two, and that would leave me with one which I think does have the potential to be a finalist of the competition, based on my own personal reading taste of course, but also looking at some of the titles that have been finalists in previous iterations of the SPFBO competition. I don't think this book, for me, would look out of place alongside them. So the two titles that I thought were good but not quite good enough were The Soul's Aspect by Mark Holloway and I Shall Return with Winter by C.F. Welburn. These are both really good books. I highly recommend you take a look at them if the synopsis interests you. But these two titles were really good, I really enjoyed them, but I just didn't see them as being my semi-finalist. So that means Fire of the Forebears is the last book standing from my allocation of 6. I'm really pleased about this one actually, because when I read it, I knew right at the time that this book had a really good chance, and I was actually a little bit nervous that I had 2 more books to read after that one, and one of them or both of them could potentially be as good and make it a really difficult decision for me. Overall, this was the one that I had the best time with. It was my favourite, but it's also the one that I can see going furthest in the competition. So I'm happy that those two aspects that I was looking at and that I was taking into consideration, they marry up quite nicely. And I'm really interested to see now in the immediate term what Bookborn thinks of this one, and of course what the other semi-finalists are going to be from my co-judges and what Bookborn will think of those ones as well. So thank you all of the authors for putting your books forward for consideration in this competition, and congratulations to LA Book, who can now say that she is an SPFBO semi-finalist. So I had a really good experience with SPFBO8. I've picked up a new favourite, I've got another series to continue with and some other books that I enjoyed as well. So just want to say thank you to Bookborn for inviting me to be part of her judging panel, and of course to Mark Lawrence for running this competition in the first place. I've always enjoyed following the SPFBO competition, and I'm going to continue to follow this one. I will be putting out more content for this competition in the future, so if you want to see those videos when they come out, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you get notification when I put out new content. Outside of SPFBO on my channel, I do primarily book reviews and recommendations. Almost all of those are fantasy and a large portion is self-published fantasy. I also do a monthly showcase where I invite self-published authors to submit a short video talking about their books to put them in front of a new audience. So keep your eye out for those coming out around the 20th of each month as well. So I hope you've enjoyed following me on this SPFBO judging journey as much as I've enjoyed reading the books that go into these videos. Let me know in the comments down below what you thought of my choices here, the cuts that I've made and the semi-finalists that I've selected. How do you think Fire of the Forebears is going to fare in the remainder of the competition? Don't forget to check the description box below the video for links to all of my dedicated reviews to these 6 titles. You'll also find all of my social media and support the channel links there, including my book club Discord and my Patreon. I hope to see you in the next video sometime soon, but until then, as always, take care of yourselves, read some good books. Bye for now.